Good morning, Sarah.
Good
So
morning.
I think it's time so we can get started. Um, Hello, everyone, and welcome to the United Nations University Institute for Water, Environment, and Health Science Talk series in this, our 30th anniversary year. My name is Lu-Ying Wang, UNU-INWEH's Public Outreach and Education Associate, and I'm delighted to be your host for today's Science Talk. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, our Science Talk showcased the diverse, policy relevant, and interdisciplinary research of UNU-INWEH and our global network of experts. These sessions are designed not only to share cutting-edge science, but also to explore how that science translates into real-world solutions for water, environment, and health challenges around the globe. Today's session, like all of our talks, is being recorded. The video will be made available in an open access format following the event. And you can find recordings of all previous science talk on demand via our website and YouTube channel at unu.edu/inway/science talk-talks. As always, we'll conclude with an interactive Q&A session. Please feel free to post your questions in the chat at any point during the presentation, and we will address as many as possible towards the end of today's session. Today's science talk is entitled Storing and Managing Water for the Environment is More Efficient Than Mimicking Natural Flows, a priority-based water balance operations model and a reservoir temperature model. And it is my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Professor Sarah Null. Professor Null's research focuses on balancing aquatic ecosystem protection with human water needs. She examines the trade-offs in water use, climate change adaptation, and environmental water management, particularly for saline lakes. At UNU-INWEH, she leads interdisciplinary work on drought and flood management, dam and reservoir operations, ecosystem water efficiency, climate adaptation, and water quality. She's also a professor of watershed sciences at Utah State University and has received major awards from the U.S. National Science Foundation and Environmental Protection Agency. Her work has been featured in outlets such as the New York Times, Science, National Geographic, and BBC Newsday, and she has contributed to policy-focused research on the Great Salt Lake. Please join me in welcoming Professor Knowles for today's Science Talk. The floor is yours. Welcome.
Great, thank you. I'm trying to get my slide shared.
Yes, it's up on the screen now.
Okay, but it looks like it's not going into
the presenter mode. Yeah.
I'll just do that. There we go. Okay, thank you for having me. I think the wrong abstract was read. I'm talking today about can environmental water markets sustain Utah's Great Salt Lake? Okay, so globally, terminal lakes are declining. So terminal lakes are lakes that have no outlet. So water flows into them through direct precipitation or stream inflows, and there's no stream outlet. So the only way that water leaves is through evaporation. That means that the lakes tend to be very high in mineral content or salty, we like to think of them. So this map on the left is showing everywhere with blue dots were once really large lakes, greater than 250 square kilometers. The figure on the right shows some well-studied lakes, and you can see that really the common thread among all of them is that they're declining through time there on the x-axis. Great Salt Lake is exactly the same, unfortunately. So Great Salt Lake in the 80s was really high. You can see that in this kind of left satellite image from the 80s. At that time, the state was pumping water out into the desert west of the lake to protect the infrastructure around the lake, like the airport and the roads. So in the 80s, we were really concerned about high lake levels. Since then, we've gone into a number of dry years. We also have high consumptive water uses in the basin. And so in 2022, we reached the historic low, the lowest point that we've ever measured in the record. We're a little bit recovered since 2022, but we're certainly not in the healthy level, and we'll talk about that more in just a minute. Okay, Great Salt Lake reached, I would say, international media attention in 2022 and still continuing. And so articles like this one, is Great Salt Lake on the brink of collapse? And here you can see some of the stromatolites in the lake that are exposed to air, and I'll talk more about those in just a minute. It was so low that the measurements, no longer the gauging around the lake was exposed to air. It was no longer working. You can see this is a marina that's dry. It's no longer functioning. So at these really low lake levels, we have problems with ecosystems and with human health, but also the infrastructure again is threatened by the very low lake levels. Okay, so what we're going to talk today, this is a more wide-ranging talk than one particular study. So we're going to talk about why we care about Great Salt Lake, the hydrology of the lake and the causes for lake decline. Then we're going to go into some Monte Carlo simulations of the water requirements needed to sustain Great Salt Lake. With that, we're going to shift a little bit to the recent legislative changes that the state has made to try to protect the lake. And then finally, we're going to talk about some environmental water markets and see how effective they've been for the lake. Look at the dedicated water to the lake. And then we're going to come back and link back into some ideas that are really should be very familiar to this group about thinking about rigid water demands and water bankruptcy in this basin. Okay, a lot of the data that I'm using for this is is from the Great Salt Lake Strike Team. And if you're going, wow, what is the Great Salt Lake Strike Team? That sounds really exciting. Do they bomb the lake, or are they terrible at baseball? Well, no, it's in fact this next one. We are a group of scientists and agency leads, and we're all working together to get consistent, high quality, relevant data in front of decision makers. So we're trying to agree on data sets and really all use the same data and get data sets into the hands of people making decisions for the lake. Okay, so I'm going to talk a lot about lake level in this talk, lake level or lake elevation. And it's really important because it affects the ecology, it affects the economy in the lake, it affects air quality through dust, and with that, human health. Great Salt Lake, starting kind of at this left, it has a railway causeway that splits the lake in two. And so it has a fresher portion that's in green here and a saltier lower portion that's red from some bacteria. The lake has a very simple but productive food web. So the lower the lake gets, the saltier it gets, and eventually that threatens the productivity of the lake, kind of in this first arrow. These arrows are trying to show the y-axis is really high lake levels, the bottom is really low lake levels. And then these are different attributes, the arrows that we care about. So the salinity is a big one. The bay habitats, generally as the lake gets higher, the bay habitats are healthier. Lots of bacterial diversity in the lake, and that's really the base of the food web, even though we usually don't think about bacteria for Great Salt Lake, we want to. That gets healthier with higher lake levels. Things like islands at very low lake levels become exposed or become connected to land. So those ecosystems are really threatened by predators. Wetlands are healthiest right in the middle at very high lake levels. They become kind of washed out. And at very low lake levels, like we're at right now, they're disconnected from the lake completely. And then dust is really important. As the lake level declines, more playa is exposed. The lake naturally has heavy metals and some toxins and some things that we don't want to be breathing. However, that sediment is very fine. It's smaller than PM10, which means that our lungs can't do a very good job of filtering it out. So when we get low lake levels and lots of playa exposed, and then we get wind events, it can create these huge dust storms. I'm going to show you in another map coming up. Most of Utah's population is right near Great Salt Lake, so this impacts a couple millions of people. And then the lake, I would say, is more hemispherically important or globally important. It's part of the Pacific Flyway. So I have Great Salt Lake circled here in the red. You can see some of the main portions of the flyway. I'm going to talk again really quickly about its basic ecology. There's lots of algae and bacteria in the lake that supports brine shrimp and brine flies, some macroinvertebrates. And then from those, millions of birds migrate to the lake each year, and it's kind of like a food buffet for them. So they come and eat and eat and eat. As places like the Colorado River Delta have become dry, the Colorado River no longer connects with the Sea of Cortez, it's mean that places like Great Salt Lake are even more important on the flyway. And then in Utah, we care a lot about Great Salt Lake because the Olympics are coming in 2034. So that means that we have 8 short years to hopefully turn the lake into a healthy place. Everybody wants, all the eyes of the world are going to be looking at Utah. Many visitors will be here, and we want the lake to be a success. We want it to be at a nice, healthy level. Okay, so a lake balance for Terminal Lake is really blissfully easy. So the volume of the lake is simply the stream flow that comes into it, plus groundwater, plus any direct precipitation, minus evaporation from the lake, and then in this case, minus diversions. Usually terminal lakes don't have diversions because that water is salty, but we have mineral extraction. So some water is diverted from the lake itself. As you move upstream, the water balance becomes really complicated. Even immediately upstream of the lake, this figure is showing 3 rivers flowing neatly into the south portion of the lake. In reality, it's pretty complex, as anyone who's studied rivers and wetlands tends to know. But all the fresh water flows, except for direct precipitation, all the stream flow flows into the southern portion. We call it the southern arm of the lake. And with this, in this map, you can see the high lake level, which is in tan. You can see all that playa exposed. And this is, we're maybe a touch higher than this blue lake level is shown right here. This is a 2021 level. Okay, so here we have another similar map. You can see now in green, we have agriculture. In yellow, we have the urban areas. So the southern portion of the lake, the Provo and the Ogden basins are increasingly more and more developed. They're mostly municipal and urban water uses. The Bear River, which is the biggest stream flow contributor, is primarily agriculture. And here you can see generally kind of where water comes from that makes it to Great Salt Lake. I think I already talked about this. There's a solid fill causeway. So there are some openings in the causeway where water moves through, but slowly. All right, so now let's look at some Great Salt Lake levels. And this is going back to 1850. And you can see a couple periods of really high flows in the late 80s and again the 1980s. And then since the 1980s, we've really been in this declining trajectory. You can also see in this figure where we start to get 2 lines after 1960 when that causeway was turned into a solid fill causeway. So now we have a lake level for the north arm and for the south arm. And sometimes we just think of the volume of the lake and we ignore that for scientists. And then zooming in more the recent past, so the recent few years, this is a nice figure. You can see the difference, especially in wet years when lots of fresh water might come in. So 2023 here, we had a really nice wet year. You can see that the south arm will reach a much higher elevation faster, and then they'll kind of come together over a couple years. Couple other things to point out is terminal lakes have a seasonal pattern to them. So they get in the spring runoff, they get most of their flow. They'll tend to reach the year's high at that point. Right around now, I think it's already passed here this year. We had a very early spring. And then by late fall, usually you're at the low points for the year. So we tend to get this kind of yearly pattern. But overall, we've had lake decline. The lake right now, the south arm is at 4192 feet. And I apologize for the more international audiences. I have a lot of slides for local stakeholders. And so I have a mix of American and metric units here. Okay, so let's look. It's easy for people to say, okay, the lake is declining. because of climate change. So let's take a look at the inflows to the lake. So on the top here, I have precipitation through time. Precipitation in the last 20 years, we've been in a drought really through the whole American West. We've been in a drought. We've had lots of dry years, but statistically, we haven't seen a change in stream flow, in part because the very dry years have been punctuated or interrupted by these super wet years that you can see in the record here. Just a few of them, but altogether, we haven't seen a significant trend for drying. This next one is stream temperature, and we do have a trend here in recent years where temperature is increasing, and this matters because it increases evaporative demand, of course. Groundwater storage, I'd say this is a ripe area of research in the basin, trying to get a handle on our groundwater, how much there is, how much we've changed it through pumping, where exactly the groundwater is. And we think that there's a decline of groundwater storage in recent years. And then stream flows, again, haven't kind of mirroring precipitation. Those haven't generally changed. Most of our stream flow comes from snowmelt. Okay, so consumptive water uses to the lake. These are high, so this black line is showing all consumptive uses added together. So this is water that's diverted upstream of the lake for the most part, except for mineral extractions, that doesn't come back to the lake. It's consumed. Agriculture is still the biggie. It's about 2/3 of the water in the basin is used by agriculture. Municipal industrial, so that's urban and industrial. That's about 1/3 of the water. And then we have some smaller uses, so reservoir evaporation, mineral extraction. Behind this is a gray line, incidental loss. That means riparian consumptive uses and wetland consumptive uses. So altogether, I'd say these are quite high. About 2.5 million acre feet in some years of consumptive water uses in an arid basin here in the West. You'll notice that these lines are generally flat. The urban trend line is increasing a bit, even though per capita is actually decreasing a bit. But you might go, well, why is the lake declining? Because since the 80s, these lines are about flat. And that's true. That's what policymakers would say. However, if we go back a little farther, we can see, looking at this top figure here, we can see that while our consumptive use lines are pretty flat, they just are very high, and they started rising earlier than a lot of our modeling goes back to our measured data. But this top figure on the right here showing the portion that goes to agriculture and urban uses, reservoir evaporation again, wetlands, the solar ponds, the mineral evaporation. So all of these things are using water increasingly. They're taking portions from agriculture, but we've had very high consumptive uses in the basin for decades. So while they're consistently high now, they remain high. And we think that without these consumptive uses, the lake would be about 13 vertical feet higher right now, so well in the healthy range. Okay, so thinking about what's going on with the lake, why is it so low? We do have increased evaporation from climate warming. We also have a lot of natural variability, and that variability is increasing. But the piece we can change that's really the biggest portion also is the consumptive use piece. That's the portion we think is, somewhere maybe 2/3 of the water to maybe 3/4, and that's the policy level. That's the piece that we can change. Okay, so I'm going to go through some summary slides as we go, kind of building on what we learned. So we know the Great Salt Lake is declining. We know that human consumptive water uses cause that decline. All right, now with some of the work of the Great Salt Lake Strike team, and I put Dave Tarbotten's picture here because he really led this portion of the research. We did some Monte Carlo simulations of the water requirements to sustain Great Salt Lake. And so we used just the last 25 years of thinking, we do have higher evaporative rates, and we've been in this dry period, so we're going to use the last 25 years as representative of the future. With Monte Carlo simulations, you resample all of that data. So the stream flow coming in, the precipitation, the evaporation, you resample all of it. I think we ran 1,000 simulations. And there's some uncertainty, of course, here, right? We don't know what the future is going to hold, but going back the whole historical period maybe seemed like a stretch, but maybe we'll be a little bit wetter than the last 25 years, maybe a little drier. We're not quite sure about that part. All right, so here's our baseline of simulation. So this is taking the last 25 years exactly as they were and projecting them into the future. And so our average inflow here is coming into the lake is about 1.6 million acre feet. And you can see that this mean lake elevation is still in this serious adverse effects. So these colors map over on the right, map the green portion is the healthy lake elevations. The pink is the transitory. You're starting to be maybe a little bit off from the healthy, and then you start getting into adverse effects and very serious adverse effects. So if we continue on with the consumptive uses that we have, we will probably stay in the serious adverse effects with some, proportion. If we get really the 10% worst years, will be way low, way much drier than we've ever seen before. And then we have when the Olympics are anticipated to come into the future. So we know that this baseline isn't where we want to be, right? So the question is, how much water do we have to add? So as an example, let's add 250,000 acre feet per year. So each year, another 250,000 acre feet of year. And how we get there isn't totally important yet, right? We're just saying, what if through water markets or through anything, we could free up that water? And here that raises us, this alternative, it raises the mean. We're into the adverse effects, but we're still really on the average lake level, we're really nowhere near the healthy lake level. Maybe, 10%, if we just get this lucky combination of very wet years, we might get there, but in all likelihood, we're still the lake level is much too low. So then we thought, okay, well, what if we increase this to 800,000 acre feet each year of additional water coming to Great Salt Lake? And here now we are starting to be in the ballpark that we want. So we have a period probably where the lake would be rising, and then it tends to stable off as the lake level increases. It has more direct precipitation coming to it, but also more evaporation with a higher lake level, higher surface area, greater surface area. But this looks pretty promising in the right ballpark, right, of where we want to be. And so this seems like a pretty good target then. What we're looking for to sustain the lake in the long term is probably in the ballpark of about 800,000 acre feet per year. Again, I think I can skip this one. All right, so a couple caveats about this work. We use the last 25 years only to represent the future. A warmer climate may actually make things worse. That may lead to drier conditions than we're simulating here. We've also been in a period of drought, so maybe the lake level, or excuse me, maybe precipitation will be a little bit higher. But altogether, this is trying to demonstrate about how much water we might need to reach a healthy lake level. All right. So now I've put this finally into millions of cubic meters here. So about 800,000 acre feet per year, about, 950-ish million cubic meters of water per year is needed to get into that healthy lake level range. All right, and this slide is a little dry, I know that, but I wanted to talk about some of the recent legislative changes because our state legislature has been very active in making changes to pave the way to sustain the lake. So I'm going to highlight a couple important bills. So the first one is the water banking bill. So the legislature created a legal framework to create water banks. Water banks are like water markets, but there might be kind of a centralized bank that could buy and sell, help with the transactions to buy and sell or lease that water so that for your water right changes, you don't have to do them maybe each year. They could be a little bit more centralized, and the idea is to take some of the bureaucratic burden off. So we had a water banking bill in 2000, really creating that legal framework for water markets. This next one, this in-stream water flow amendment sounds so dry, but it's so important. So before 2022, water to Great Salt Lake was not a beneficial use of water. So as far as water rights go, anybody else could take the water, but bringing it to the lake was legally a waste. We might say, aesthetically or economically, that wasn't true, but legally it was a waste. So this bill said water to sovereign lands like Great Salt Lake is now a beneficial use of water. So this was super important to be able to get water to the lake. These next ones, we've had a lot of money put into irrigation, improving irrigation efficiency around the lake, improving M&I efficiency around the lake. The Great Salt Lake Enhancement Trust endowed the Great Salt Lake Enhancement Trust with $40 million, and that $40 million is meant to lease water. So temporary leases meant to bring water to the lake. So some money was put behind this water markets idea. And then we've had some adaptive, I would say, adaptive management kind of changes. So we have a Great Salt Lake Commissioner who's supposed to develop and implement a strategic plan for the lake. We have increased modeling capabilities with the Great Salt Lake Integrated Plan. And then we have a water rights distribution management plan really showing and being transparent about the administration of water rights to the lake itself. So all of these together coming out here. So we've had these legislative changes even to our water law, our water code, meant to support Great Salt Lake recovery. All right, now we're going to finally kind of start talking about water markets. And I'm going to start very, very generally here. So in the Western US, the environment typically hasn't received water rights. So when water rights were allocated, starting in the 1800s, say, and moving into the 1900s, usually environmental water demands didn't receive any water rights. They were just kind of there. So now we're in this future here in the Western US where most of our natural places do not have any dedicated water. So there's a few options. So water markets is one of those. So those are voluntary temporary leases or permanent purchases of water. And there's been some big success stories like the Oregon Water Trust, the Washington Water Trust. Utah's hoping that the Great Salt Lake Watershed Enhancement Trust will be one of those success stories. So the idea is to reallocate water. So you can lease it, temporarily buy it, and bring some water back to the environment. Some other states have gone with regulations. So this is saying that water must satisfy environmental laws and rules. So often it uses as a backbone things like the Endangered Species Act or the Clean Water Act and says to uphold these acts, some water must be provided for these species or for these habitats or to maintain water quality. Sometimes lawsuits go along with those regulations. Other states have invested pretty heavily in the regulatory approach. I'd say Utah's not that state. We're a little bit allergic maybe to regulatory approaches here. You can reform your water law completely. Australia has done that. This is a pretty big change. So it's not a very common one. And then sometimes some junior water rights are granted in basins that aren't fully allocated. But a lot of Western basins are fully allocated, like the Great Salt Lake Basin is fully allocated. No new large water rights are being allocated anymore. All right, and then one of my students, Gabby, shown here on the top right, did a peer review in the literature, wanting to look at the water volume and cost of environmental water markets. We found in the literature environmental water markets in the Western US, in Australia, and in Spain. There are water markets in other places. They're pretty common, but they might not be for the environment. So these are the places that we could document how the volume of water that was reallocated to the environment and the cost of it. So altogether, she found 10.7 billion cubic meters of water has been temporarily leased for the environment, and another 4.9 billion cubic meters of water has been permanently purchased. So that permanently purchased water is more valuable. It's always more expensive, and it's more valuable because you get those benefits year after year. However, in the US, these purchases and leases account for about 0.2% of the annual freshwater withdrawals. So what this says to me is that water markets can be locally important and they can support ecosystems. They haven't really achieved the large-scale reallocation of water that's probably needed to sustain ecosystem and natural places. We've also done some work. This is a study I did a couple years ago with Eric Edwards and myself, and we wanted to look at how much it would cost to purchase water, or in this case, we used uniform cutback. So we said people are going to get curtailed. And then we said, or people can trade water. We can establish water markets. And we always found that water markets consistently were the cheaper option than just curtailing everybody and saying everybody must use yes. So in this figure, we're saying, what if everybody had to use 11% less water, or 20%, or 29%? At that point, we weren't quite sure how much water, how much extent of curtailments it would be required to save Great Salt Lake. And then the darkest grayest bar is uniform, everybody gets curtailed. And then we started adding in water transfers. So within basin or multi-basin water transfers, and that always reduced the price. So there's the take-home message of that slide. All right, and now let's look at how much water has actually been dedicated and delivered to Great Salt Lake. So this is, I'd say, kind of the big piece. These have all been from voluntary agreements. So those are negotiated commitments. None of them have actually been through water markets. The first one was in 2021. So you can see we've had 5 years of dedicating water now to Great Salt Lake. The numbers in white are in acre feet, the numbers in black are in millions of cubic meters. So you can see that this number is increasing, and we've had, I would say, in the basin, we've had success with these voluntary agreements. Where do these agreements, like who is agreeing to deliver some of their water to Great Salt Lake? And we've had a bunch. Some have been mineral extraction companies. One company went out of business and their water rights went to the lake. Some companies have voluntarily changed their practices or delivered some water. There's been some conservancy districts, some nonprofit groups like Ducks Unlimited. Sorry, the conservancy districts like Jordan Valley, that's in the southern portion of the basin. East Jordan Irrigation Company, Kennecott Copper Mine. So you can see that there's a number of entities that have been willing to enter into these voluntary agreements, that sometimes 1 year only, sometimes multiple years, they'll dedicate some of their water to Great Salt Lake. But looking at these numbers, we're really not in the ballpark that we want to be. So in the bottom, I put this reminder that we want to be in about 800,000 acre feet each year of additional water to the lake. So we're really not there yet, even though this has been promising so far. And then to put these voluntary agreements into perspective, I tried to put all of the flows together in one place. So this top portion has the undedicated water to Great Salt Lake. So most of the water that's getting to Great Salt Lake right now is not dedicated. It's the excess water that flows downstreams. It is sometimes reservoir spill in the winter. It's the return flows that come back to the lake at the bottom of the basin. So we have flows entering the lake. However, looking at this bottom figure, and this bottom figure now brings in some of the consumptive uses and tries to put them all on the same scale. So the bottom, all the green is agricultural consumptive uses. The orange is municipal M&I. The gray is mineral extraction from the lake. And then this blue, I took the inflow minus the evaporation from the lake. And that's important because otherwise it looks like always water's coming to the lake, but the lake evaporates close to 2 million acre feet each year, just in evaporation. So we need, so it takes a lot of water. So you can see the years, really only the wet years, that the lake is receiving more water than it evaporates. But we're not getting enough of these wet years. And then I started in pink here, adding in this dedicated water, and hopefully this value will grow through time. But water leases from irrigation efficiency programs. So if you remember, the state has put about $2 million into irrigation efficiency programs. And so far, none of that water, with the idea that there could be conservation and the conserved water could be leased to anybody, but the lake could be maybe one person who might purchase leased water, the Great Salt Lake Enhancement Trust. But so far, no water has been leased to Great Salt Lake from irrigation efficiency programs. And I put agricultural optimization. That's what we call these irrigation efficiency programs in Utah, but It's kind of, I would say, very local slang. The reallocating conserved water was not a requirement of getting that funding. So the state really separated this funding from actually reallocating water or releasing it. So I'd say we need policies that better connect conservation subsidies with bringing water to Great Salt Lake. Or maybe we don't need these irrigation efficiency programs unless we want them from other reasons. Probably they're leading to drying in the basin. And so I have a picture here. It's not quite as easy as just backing up a ladder into the Louvre and taking all this water. It's proved to be a pretty challenging problem. Okay, so what do we have so far? Environmental markets could play a role, but so far, looking at the literature, they could play a supporting role, but they probably don't reallocate enough water on a global scale to cover ecosystem needs. Voluntary agreements have been really successful for the basin. Water markets themselves really haven't been. There's been, I would say, maybe some barriers or some reasons that farmers and irrigators don't transfer their water to the lake. One of those problems is in Utah, irrigation districts tend to be the water right holders, and then they have shares of water to different producers or farmers. So producers or farmers could get these subsidies to improve their irrigation efficiency, but they're not the water right holder. So there's been a few disconnects, I would say, here in the Great Salt Lake. These disconnects really mirror all of the literature about irrigation efficiency. And so this was a study. This is some figures from a really nice peer-reviewed study. These folks were looking at water consumption from modernizing irrigation technology. And here's some examples of studies they found in the US, Spain, and India. And all of the red dots are showing that these irrigation technology or irrigation improvement programs use more water. For many of you in this audience, this will probably not be a surprise. So generally, they tend to make farms maybe more productive and more valuable. They might put more land into production, and they don't tend to reduce water requirements. And the same has been true here in the Great Salt Lake Basin. And of course, this has been published a number of times in some pretty major outlets. All right, and then one more, I would say, future change that we have on the horizon is some proposed dams on the Bear River. So the Bear River is the tributary that brings the most water to Great Salt Lake. There are dams that have been proposed. There's a legislative act to build these dams, but it keeps being postponed. So right now it's postponed maybe till the 2060s. There aren't good studies of the impacts of these dams on Great Salt Lake. So one of my grad students shown here, this is yet to be published right now, but he wanted to say, okay, if these dams were built, what would be the change to Great Salt Lake level? Because in a way, there are some, I feel like some competing legislative actions. One is to build dams and the other is to save Great Salt Lake. And these two, it's hard to reconcile them. So here in this figure on the right, we have the same shading of Great Salt Lake level that we're showing on the y-axis through time. This was modeled changes, but kind of over the past year. So this dashed line is the observed lake level. You can see it decline from the 80s. And then he put in the kind of bottom darkest line is if you build all of these dams at their capacity. And then he even put some regulations, even though the state doesn't like regulations, like what if there tends to be 10% of stream flows have to remain in stream and make it to the Great Salt Lake, or 25% have to remain in stream and make it to the Great Salt Lake. And still we found that, the lake it would probably decline by somewhere between 2 to 4 additional feet. Depends where exactly, because the lake, what lake level you start at makes a great deal of difference. But the basic message is these proposed dams would further decline Great Salt Lake. All right, and now I'm going to show a little bit of preliminary data from a study that we're looking at, I would say, rigid consumptive water demands and how they drive Western U.S. water insolvency. So we're picking up on some of the ideas of the water bankruptcy from the recent report by Dr. Madani and others in this group. And we wanted to look at 3 basins here in the West that are all pretty different. So the San Joaquin Basin in California, Great Salt Lake Basin here in Utah, and then the Lower Rio Grande. The Lower Rio Grande and the San Joaquin Basin have big groundwater or aquifers that have been being depleted. Here in Great Salt Lake, there's a terminal lake, of course, at the end, and that's been being depleted, although not from direct diversions. Okay, so these are busy figures, but I'm going to walk you through them. So on the top, we have all of the basins, the Lower Rio Grande, the Great Salt Lake, San Joaquin Valley. The top ones we're showing crop area. So in some places, most of the basin's crop areas actually decreased a little bit. The middle figures, D, E, and F, we're showing the ET volume, so the evapotranspiration volume. Some basins have increases. Great Salt Lake is the only one I think that has a bit of a decrease. And in those figures, you can see the main crops that are being grown. And then this final figure here, we have let's see, we have potential evapotranspiration, and that's the red line. And so this is, to me, this kind of shows evaporative demand. And in all the bases, this is increasing. This is saying without any changes to what we're doing, we'd expect evaporative demand to be increasing from climate warming. And that makes sense. And then this teal figure is crop ET. So this is actually from sometimes crop changes or from more intensive water uses, things like irrigation efficiency programs that end up using more water. So the shaded band in the middle is kind of this double hit that basins are getting, where demands aren't increasing. In fact, they tend to be, or excuse me, they're not decreasing at all, and they tend to be increasing, right? They tend to be increasing from increased evaporative demands and from our crop choices or our water use practices or things like that. So we're having this double hit, even in these terminal basins. And so this really ties into the idea that this group has been talking a lot with global water bankruptcy. And with that, I put a picture here. This is on the left is the Bear River. This is from last fall, and you can see the Bear River. This is right in the Bear River Bay, but the Bear River is no longer connecting with the Great Salt Lake last fall. We expect this. We had a very, very low snowpack winter like most of the West did. So we expect this to be the case this year too, unless we happen to get a lot of monsoon rainfall in August and September. I would guess that the Bear River would once again dry before meeting Great Salt Lake. Okay, so the summary so far, the big takeaway points that we're adding to. Now, I would say that some of our very rigid water demands drive water insolvency. We've been tending to use the word insolvency versus bankruptcy with trying to indicate like a hope that maybe we could come back from that. And we do have some glimmers of hope here in the Great Salt Lake Basin, like voluntary agreements to deliver water to Great Salt Lake have been very successful. Water banking really has not, but we're hoping maybe that with the right price structure or maybe figuring out some of the barriers currently preventing people from engaging in water markets, that maybe some people will try. Maybe it just takes that brave producer to be one of the first to try. But so there's some glimmers of hope. We are getting more water to the Great Salt Lake. We have these very hardened demands, rigid demands. So at the end of the day, some people are going to have to use less water. I would say the urban water use efficiency has been successful in the sense that it's offsetting growth. So urban water users generally, that line is generally flat, and the conservation there is really offsetting growth. So per capita, we're using less and less water. And then with that, that's the end of my slides. Here's my email if anyone would like to get a hold of me. Of course, UNU-INWEH and all of some of the other funders and collaborators to this work. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Professor Null, for the really insightful presentation. And I especially appreciated how you connected the physical hydrology of the Great Salt Lake with institutional and policy mechanisms like water markets. The way you combined modeling, particularly the Monte Carlo simulation with the real world governance constraints, was very compelling. And it really highlights the gap between what is scientifically required and what is institutionally feasible. So here I have 4 questions. The first question is on the gap between required inflows and policy reality. So you show that roughly 800,000 acre-feet per year is needed to sustain a healthy lake level, which is significantly higher than the current dedicated inflow. So based on your talk, how would you say we should think about closing this gap in practice? Do you see this as primarily a policy design problem, a political economy challenge, or more of a structural constraint in the water rights system? Are there any examples, either in Utah or elsewhere? Are there any other places in the world where large reallocations have actually been achieved or even partially?
That's a great question, and there's a lot to it. So first of all, how are we going to get to this about 800,000 feet per year of extra water? I guess I would say first, no, it's a all of the above kind of options. There's probably not one magic bullet that's going to get us there. We're going to need to get water from everywhere we can. There's some low-hanging fruit that I would say that we could do. All of the winter water that comes in, and so by that I mean all the undedicated water that might be reservoir spill or return flows, we should get that dedicated so that it stays to the lake. That's not really going to get us to the 800,000 extra water, but it's going to stop us from reducing flows more. There are some policy changes we could make, like we could make requirements that for urban or agricultural water users that do efficiency improvements, that there's a requirement to actually lease some of that water to another user. So right now those are disconnected. That would be promising. We're trying to understand more about our groundwater basins. The groundwater and Great Salt Lake level we think should mirror each other somewhat. So we think if Great Salt Lake is declining, probably the groundwater basins are also, but more research needs to be done there. In terms of success stories for terminal lakes, there's a whole lot of non-success stories. I would say Mona Lake in California has reached an agreement for a stable level, although they haven't hit it yet. And that was through litigation. That was through a lawsuit. This basin has mostly avoided lawsuits, which is nice, and that people keep working together. There is one lawsuit right now taken that the state agencies aren't really upholding their responsibilities to provide water to the basin. So again, maybe this is coming into the all of the above approach. Every action is happening. The last thing that I would say is in Utah, the water rights, the state engineer has put a sustainable yield on some groundwater basins. So they've said, that we need to hit this sustainable yield for the groundwater basin, and after that, we'll curtail groundwater pumpers. Something similar could be done, but for whatever reason, those have not been done for surface water, even though they have been for groundwater. So it seems to me that that is also a potential option.
Great, thank you. We have a question from our Rohit, please.
Thank you so much, Dr. Null, for a very, very interesting presentation. I was wondering if you could comment a little bit onto what extent water markets are kind of reinforcing or challenging the existing kind of power structures between, agricultural stakeholders, urban stakeholders, environmental stakeholders. So either the challenge or the reinforcement elements, and whether there are specific kind of governance mechanisms that need to ensure, environmental flows are prioritized over, kind of just traded, opportunistically kind of thing.
Yeah, that's a great question, because often with water markets, there comes some problems also, right? There can be externalities or third-party problems that we didn't envision. Sometimes water markets can be regulated to some extent, like there might be rules about who can participate and who cannot participate. And so right now, we don't have those rules. A lot of the conservation funding, I think, was intended to free up some water that could be bought by the Great Salt Lake Watershed Enhancement Trust, so to be bought for the lake. But it's not really a requirement. You know, people could lease water to another agricultural producer, you know, and so in that way, right now, as the markets are set up, they're pretty open-ended to just be a water reallocation mechanism. There are some rules that the water has to stay in the basin, so the water can't be marketed like to out of state to a different basin completely. So there are those requirements that any markets have to stay within the basin. They have to stay local. Because water markets are so nascent, like they're just starting here and they haven't really taken off. My guess is that if they were to take off, we might see some problems and then some more requirements or rules might follow those. But there's so much at the beginning stages, and there's been such a reluctance to participate that we haven't even gotten that far.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. So the second question from my end is on the limits of environmental water markets. So you noted that environmental water markets have played a role locally, but have not led to large-scale reallocation of water. What do you see as the main limiting factors here? Is it transactions cost, lack of incentives, legal barriers, or simply insufficient supply? And building on that, do you think improving market design alone would be sufficient, or do we need complementary regulatory or legislative interventions to make markets effective at this scale?
Yeah, that's another great question. There have been some barriers that are more institutional that I know the state is working on. Like, for example, a few years ago, to do a water lease or a water market, you need to change your water right with the state engineer, the Division of Water Rights. And that's you've always been able to do that, actually. That's not new. To do that, though, it used to take close to a year. So I know the Division of Water Rights has been working really hard to cut that process down so that water markets and reallocations of water can happen, say, within a season. So you don't need to prepare so early. And that's important because, you know, if the year is a wet year or if it's a dry year, matters a lot for water leases. And a place like Great Salt Lake, it doesn't necessarily, the water year type doesn't matter quite as much as, say, for producers. So if there's a really wet year and farmers or producers have extra water, that would be a great time for representatives of the lake to purchase water, because we just need to bring that lake level up. So trying to remove some institutional barriers so that we can have these seasonal leases is an important piece. That being said, there are clearly other barriers that have yet to be addressed. Like I mentioned, some challenges with irrigation districts where maybe the incentive structures just aren't there. And so that's something that I know lots of decision makers in the state are trying to work on, some ways to reallocate water from irrigation districts or to make incentives for them too.
Thank you, Sarah. One more question on irrigation efficiency and unintended outcomes, please. So I found it particularly interesting that irrigation efficiency programs have not resulted in additional water reaching the lake because conserved water is not required to be reallocated. Could you elaborate on how policy could better link efficiency gains to actual environmental outcomes? Would it be politically and practically feasible to require that some of the water saved through efficiency program is actually sent to the lake? If not, what other approaches might work better?
Yeah, I mean, it could be made a requirement. I'm sure it wouldn't be a popular requirement, but it could be part of a stipulation that if you get state funding to improve your irrigation efficiency, for example, or or maybe your conveyance efficiency in some way. If you get state funding to do that, then you would have to estimate the portion of water saved and dedicate it to the lake to get that funding. That could be done. I think, I know that hasn't been a popular idea because, people would say, well, what if I don't quite get the conservation I think I will get, but then I'm on the hook to delivering this water. That being said, that's a challenging problem, but it doesn't seem insurmountable to me.
Awesome. Thank you, Sarah, for such a fascinating work. And thank you, everyone, for the engaging discussion. If we have no more questions. So this brings us to an end of today's UNU-INWEH Science Talk. If you enjoyed the session, remember that all of our previous talks are available on our website and YouTube channel at unu.edu/inweh/science-talks. Feel free to revisit or share them with your colleagues. We'll be back next week with another exciting presentation exploring new ideas at the intersection of water, environment, and health. Thank you all for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you at the next Science Talk.